nuggets hot. Papa nuggets hot. Papa nuggets hot. Papa nuggets.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 4 of Pop It Like It's Hot. We are broadcasting, as always, live from RIW Hobbies and Games in beautiful Livonia, Michigan.
Beautiful.
My name's Chris. I'm here with my co-hosts.
JD.
Brian DeMars.
And Cameron.
All right. And before we get started today, we would like to thank a few people who have really helped the podcast get off the ground. Deluxecoff and Popperganda, they've been on our team since day one, pushing the podcast, promoting it since episode 1. And if you haven't, hosting us on Twitch. Yeah, if you haven't checked out his content, make sure you do. Also want to shout out to the unsung hero of the podcast, Magic Mike, our producer. He doesn't want to be on the mic, but he does a lot of hard work behind the scenes. We want to thank him as well. So yeah, I guess let's get right into it. Challenge this week, the top 8 was interesting. We had 7 monocolored decks. Stompy took down another one. How do we keep letting him do this? What do you guys think about that?
Stompy's a great deck. It seems as I haven't really been involved in the metagame as of recent, but it seems that people not playing Delver, I was afraid that it was going to hurt Stompy's play, just because that's in my opinion, when I started playing at least, that was kind of the reason to play Stompy. There was a lot of mono blue going on. Wasn't too sure
whether Stompy would have a place in the metagame without Delver decks.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if Astrolabe decks were going to be able to take over, because you have good value decks that have access to really good removal now, and it was a little scary as somebody who'd played a while back, but I think it's awesome. The fact that it has a clock and is fast enough to outrace, Tron is a decent matchup for it. It's not ideal, but
I think it's interesting that the new hotness that replaced the old hotness Delver is also bad against Stompy. Jeskai Ephemerate not a very good deck against Stompy, even though it has a bunch of removal and counter spells. It just happens to be a bad matchup for. Or you want to be Stompy in that matchup.
Yeah, it stumbles just enough to let Stompy get underneath it a lot of the time.
Yeah,
it's interesting.
In a format where you're trying to trade time and usage of your mana to recur prisms and astrolabes and do these really grindy things, Stompy is just by far the most mana efficient deck. As far as I tap a forest and I use it to cast something, everything it does is just so much more high impact than most of the other decks. So that's why it's just so good at getting under people. Because by the time they're ready to interact with you, you have 6 power on the board, and there's no real way for them to undo that.
Yeah, definitely.
Is that why you think it's a better deck than, say, Goblins?
Yeah, I think its creatures are just a little bit bigger and better. The Stompy deck plays a bunch of 2/2s with upside, and the Goblin deck plays a bunch of 2/2s with downside.
Sure.
Yeah,
and Rancor is just an unbelievable card. The trade-off is the burn deck, the Goblin deck, or a burn deck gets to play with targeted removal in the form of Chain Lightning, Lightning Bolt, and even Goblin Grenade. But the creatures just can outclass. Stompy can even get over the removal in the form of Elephant Guide or Wild Mongrel or Hunger of the Howl Pack. It's very easy for them to just make a giant creature that can't be answered with the Lightning Bolt. So that's going to it's either going to push a bunch of damage through, or it's going to force the other deck into trading 2 for 1 to get it off the board. So it doesn't loop astrolabes, but it does have ways to pressure you hard enough to force you to make trades that are not advantageous.
Yeah.
And the interesting part is Stompy actually gets to play a targeted removal spell now. Because of Savage Swipe.
Yeah, it's got the green Searing Blaze, and it's 75 now.
I cannot stress that card is if that card doesn't exist, Stompy isn't winning this challenge. Stompy isn't the hot deck in Pauper. Stompy is just another mediocre bad affinity deck. It's just bad affinity, but because it has access to a 1-mana Searing Blaze, it's sort of off the charts.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
just one of the most. It's the most efficient removal spell in the format.
Yeah, Diego Brando, when I interviewed him the other week, he said, shout out to Savage Swipe. It's the best, the fairest card that's been printed for Pauper in any of the new sets. JD, it's actually interesting that you mentioned Delver decks and how they're not around anymore, because Metzel would tend to disagree with you. This guy has
I saw
been
that.
all over the challenges consistently
crazy.
with just stock. Well, we call it stock because it's his list that everybody plays.
Yeah.
Mono blue Delver.
I haven't seen it anywhere other than his list though. Like,
Yeah, he's the only guy playing it.
like
I mean, there's
more
maybe,
power to him. That's awesome. I totally respect that. It's just locally I haven't seen it as much.
Yeah, definitely. And nobody else, other people are playing it, but nobody to the success of him.
Yeah.
I talked to him a couple of weeks ago, I guess, just sort of picked his brain about Mono Blue Delver and why he still plays the deck, what his history with the deck is. And, I mean, this guy has been playing Mono Blue Delver since Storm was a thing. If we think the meta for Mono Blue Delver right now is bad, this guy was playing it against, turn 1 Red Pauper Storm. He was playing it against Peregrine Drake. He's been through the ringer, and
There's definitely something to just knowing a deck better than anybody else.
yeah.
True.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's not like it's a bad deck.
No, it's not a bad deck
I
at
think
all.
it's perfectly good deck.
It must
know,
just
it's
be
just-
hard to play because it's only him that does well with it, though.
Your decision tree, I think, is wider now than it was before as far as having to know every single answer to every single situation. So somebody who's been playing the deck a lot longer is going to be more likely to do well with that list.
It's,
Do you think it's really that like the deck is so hard to play that only this one person can play it? Or I think it has more to do with like people perceive what the metagame is and what they should play, like based on like what they read and what they think and what they look at. And like a lot of times the fringe decks just like get overlooked. Like people just don't choose to play them
That's totally fair.
because people want to. You feel so much smarter when you play Tron than when you show up with like Blue Delver,
Right.
You're like, I'm doing the good thing.
But
I'm
then you
doing
play
the
against
best
Tron with Blue Delver, and you're like, wow, this is awesome.
thing. Right, exactly. It's
Yeah.
a little bit, there's also less content available. Like, since it's like mostly just this one guy doing really well with the deck, there's like not as much content out there to like, if you go on Channel Fireball or you go on Cool Stuff or whatever, and you're looking at the articles, nobody's talking about it, so it doesn't like really spark you to want to play it. Like you're gonna want to play what like you're reading about in the content.
That makes sense.
But there's been like a lot of push to talk about Stompy because it's such a hot narrative, and I think that that's reflected in the results we're seeing. There's just more people playing it, and also the good players are playing it because they think it's a good deck because it is a good deck.
I
And
can agree
clearly,
with that.
Delver is also a good deck. There's just I think less people playing.
Yeah, I asked Metzel, why he thinks it has fallen out of favor, because there was a long time where Mono Blue Delver was the top deck in Pauper. Or maybe not the top deck, but one of the top decks. And his thoughts were that the metagame might have actually gotten a little bit better for Delver with all the new changes. He said Boros Monarch was a terrible matchup, and a lot of the main deck electrickeries that were getting run were terrible for Mono Blue Delver. Whereas Tron, on the other hand, was a pretty good matchup for Delver historically. He did mention that, with the adding of Arkham's Astrolabe, that does, increase the consistency and the speed of Tron a little bit, but that the matchup is still pretty good, just due to the velocity of cards that Delver can generate.
I think it's also worth noting, now that you're saying that, it's got me thinking, the Boros decks aren't playing Battle Screech anymore, and Battle Screech is like devastating for a deck full of 1/1 fairies and Delvers and stuff. Like,
Absolutely.
Here's 4 1/1s.
Yeah, a lot of the decks that were really tuned to beat these, not only mono blue but blue red and blue black Delver decks, they've just fallen out of favor because nobody plays Delver anymore. And so Metzel is just kind of, reaping the benefits of that shift in the metagame, and it's working for him. I mean, 2 top 8s in a row, 3rd place in this challenge. Like, you can't argue with results.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say he's probably like on the next level there. That's
Yeah.
the cool thing about like when you just cycle through the same deck over and over, you just always play it. You're bound to hit when your deck's good.
Play till it's good.
Like if you play it all the time,
Yeah.
eventually it will be good. As long as it's like a good deck, eventually the metagame like gets to a point where like it's a top option to play. Especially this is our 4th podcast, and like every week the metagame is like pretty dramatically shifting from one thing to the next. So we're seeing like a big turnaround every single week. So, and the fact that he can keep top 8ing and like performing well through all of it, like really tells me that this mono blue is like probably a deck that should be being played more than it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I did ask him, what some of the adaptations he had made to, adjust to the new metagame were, and his response was he hasn't done a whole lot, to be honest with you. He's playing Annul and Dispel in the sideboard. He's playing Force Spike in the main deck. The Annul and the Force Spike are, really to snipe those turn 1, turn 2 Astrolabes that are fixing mana for, Tron and Jeskai and these slower decks.
I feel like Force Spike is just in there because it was Daze, and and they need another counterspell.
Yeah.
Another cheap counterspell.
Absolutely. And kind of some of the decision points that he finds in the decks are, when to really go aggro and when to hold back that mana to, like I said, try and get rid of an Astrolabe before it ever hits the battlefield.
I do think the deck got a little bit harder to play with the banning of Daze because you have to actually play around. You have to actually hold up mana and know when to hold up mana instead of deploying threats.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And he echoed that sentiment exactly.
It's like having a deep understanding of who's the beatdown, like who should be the aggressor at the time is very important to the deck. Is basically what I'm getting out of that.
Yeah.
And not just who's the aggressor in this game, but who is the aggressor on this turn of the game. When is it right to play that Fairy Miscreant, and when is it right to, hold up a Force Spike or an Annul to make sure your opponent can't develop their board. And, it's really being able to think 3 and 4 turns ahead and make the right decision time after time.
Right. Assess future situations and apply your fundamentals to them.
Absolutely.
That's why I love Pauper. It's all just fundamentals.
Yeah, so we've mentioned a little bit about, some of the decks that, like Boros Monarch, for instance, that's sort of evolved now into this Jeskai mid-range deck, now that Arkham's Astrolabe is a thing, and it's easier to play those, 5 to 8 mana-fixing artifacts. Metzel actually said that he thinks with the addition of Astrolabe and Ephemerate that maybe there's not that dominant deck there now, but that in the future somebody's going to put together a 75 using those 2 cards as the focal point that's going to end up needing to see either a ban or a printing of something that will, help to mitigate their effectiveness. I guess the most popular deck we're seeing now that is utilizing those cards is this Jeskai mid-range deck. So I wanted us to take a little bit of time and sort of, discuss what makes that deck tick and dive a little bit deeper into why it's the most played deck right now.
Well, Chris, you are the Jeskai player here. What do you think?
I think Jeskai, the reason that it's the most popular is because there's a lot of people, they were, Boros Monarch players that suddenly saw their favorite deck become unplayable. Like, Boros, people still play it, but there's just more efficient and effective versions of it, Jeskai being one of them. So I think Jeskai is good right now because it fills that mid-range slot in the Pauper metagame. It can go over the top of almost any deck besides Tron, and it has the tools to go underneath that control deck like Tron, and then as the game progresses, fight it with counterspells. Now, whether or not you can do that against a control deck consistently with Jeskai is up to the skill of the player, but it has the tools to kind of do whatever you need to do in a given matchup, which is sort of the hallmark of a good mid-range deck.
I think it's also just like the kind of deck people like to play. It's just like full of sweet cantrips, and it doesn't like lose to itself very much. Like, you're very likely to like cast lands and spells in the same game. Yeah. I think that there's like a bias towards liking these types of decks. Historically, Xerox decks tend to be the best decks when they're very good. And I think this is a good Xerox deck, but I don't think it's like a broken Xerox deck. I just think it's like people are just like so ingrained to want to play decks like this.
Well, I think another thing is too, Cameron, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off or like stop you before you started. It's a 3-color deck in Pauper that isn't a Tron deck, and I think people have been looking for that like, for a long time, like Pauper players at least.
Yeah, and it's the deck kind of best equipped to use a lot of those, powerful blue spells that, a lot of people, it feels good to cast a Brainstorm. It feels good to play Preordain and, It's also the deck that gets the best removal spells. It can play 4 Screds. It can play as many lightning bolts as you want. It gets the best card draw spells. I mean, it can Muldrift or Ephemerate with the best of them. It has the option to go aggressive, with the Glint Hawk, Core Skyfisher build, or it can go with a more controlling plan that might leverage, cards like Augur of Bolas and a lot more main deck counter spells.
So I guess I'm curious, what is Jeskai good against that Tron isn't good against? Or why would you ever play Jeskai when you could play Tron? Like what matchups do you gain points in because of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you gain a few points in these aggro matchups. We've seen the results of the challenge. People are playing a lot more, all-in aggro, turn 4 kill decks just to get underneath, the Stonehorn Dignitary, Mnemonic Wall, Ghostly Flicker loops. And a mid-range deck, it gets to play 4 Screds. It can beat those decks. And at the same time, it's not completely dead to a deck like Tron because, like I said earlier, it can, in the late game, it can't play as many spells as Tron, but looping a counterspell with an Archaeomancer can get the job done.
So is the 4 Scred, is that better than just playing like Fogs and Moment's Peace and Stonehorn Dignitaries?
I think it's a playstyle thing in a lot of cases. Jeskai certainly has a lower barrier for entry. You look on MTG Goldfish, and like I said, you see a deck that's just loaded up with Preordains and, Lightning Bolt and Scred, and it's easy to look at that 75 and say, I see what this deck's trying to do. It looks like it's doing a lot of powerful stuff. I'm going to play that. Whereas, you look at a deck running 4 Stonehorn Dignitaries and a lot of really nuanced cards like Tron, and it's just harder to just jump in and be a Tron player, I guess. So is it, more powerful, less powerful than Tron? I think that's up to the individual player to decide, what their preferred playstyle is. But it certainly has the tools to be as good as any deck in the format.
I guess it's interesting that it's purported to be a good anti-aggro deck, but the deck's worst matchup is either Tron or Stompy.
Well, the other 2 best decks in the format.
Yeah.
They're great decks. So, I mean, there's a lot of decks that are going to say that. And Jeskai, you have a lot of room to build it how you want to play. I mean, if you want to tune the deck just to beat one or the other, you definitely can. But it's a mid-range deck, so yeah, a control deck can go over the top of it theoretically, and an aggro deck can go underneath it theoretically, but it's the deck in the format best suited to kind of do it all, I guess. Brian, what has been your experience with mid-range decks, I guess, in this situation?
I don't like them.
You don't like mid-range decks?
Not at all.
No.
No. So when I played last week, I played Wednesday and I played Friday, and I was talking a bunch of Pauper, and a lot of people were trying to get me onto Jeskai or Tron for the Pauper Premier League kind of a deal. And I was like, I have no interest in playing a deck in this format that isn't like 17 basic lands of the same type. I just think that's better than the other decks. Like, I just think that's the best deck.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think that, like, the upside of having 3 different colors of spells in your deck, I don't think that your cards are that much more powerful than, like, the decks that just play 17 basic lands and just all cost 1 and 2 mana. Like, your spells are slightly better, and if you get to a certain point in the game and you can, like, ephemerate a Muldrifter, it, like, lets you break ahead, but you have to jump through so many hoops to not be dead. Like, you might just be dead before that even matters, or you might do it and they might untap and kill you.
Yeah,
so, like,
that's fair.
I just think these decks are, like, they spend too much energy not interacting with the monocolored decks, and that makes me not want to play them.
I mean, I think I disagree with you to an extent that a Jeskai mid-range deck can't interact on the early turns with these aggro decks. I mean, you're still able to go turn 1 Astrolabe, draw a card, turn 2, play a Glint Hawk, and have a 2/2 flyer on 2. I mean, sure, Stompy can, get a few more creatures out, but they're not killing you through that on turn 4.
They have Savage
Swipe your Glint Hawk, play another Burning Tree Shaman.
We can go card for card. I mean,
guy.
the ideal Stompy hand, yeah, it can win. But I mean, this deck is running 4 Screds. It's running Fire Ice. It's running 2 3s that will completely blank all your Nettle Sentinels or what have you.
I would be more likely to just play Boros than I would to play Jeskai. Like, I would just the way that you beat those decks is just drawing the Boros half of your deck. You know what I mean? Like, I don't understand what the blue half does.
The blue half is good against the Tron. It's meant to be good against Tron.
Yeah, it's meant to if you.
But then why wouldn't I just play like a mono blue Delver deck if I want to be good against Tron?
If you want to do both.
Yeah, exactly. It's a mid-range deck, so it kind of it's a jack of all trades, master of none.
I don't
kind of
feel like it's
situation.
that good against both. I feel like it's like 48% against both of them. Maybe worse. Like you're not actually good against either one of the best decks. You're just like sort of okay against them. I don't know if you guys agree with that. That's what I think. That's what my experience has been. That's why I don't play these decks. But
I think the big thing is the consistency you get. I'm kind of in the same boat as you, but I think the big thing you get is consistency. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. With a Stompy deck, if you don't have, the turn you're talking about where you go turn 2 Burning Tree Emissary, Nest Invader, have your Savage Swipe mana, some hands are going to have it all. Some hands just are not. This deck kind of gives you the tools to get through those rough openings. And it has a late game. I mean, it's able to fight Stompy decks in the early game, and it's able to go toe-to-toe with Tron decks in the late game. And I think that versatility is really what draws a lot of players to it. On top of, like we said, being able to play your favorite cards like Brainstorm, Ponder, Preordain, Lightning Bolt, draw 6 cards with an Ephemerated Muldrifter on, turn 4, turn 5.
I will admit that it does feel good.
Yeah, it feels great.
I 100% agree with you on that, but that's like what I was saying where I think people are drawn to it because they like it rather than it's actually as good as they think it is. I think that it's like a familiarity thing with like liking to play like these decks that sort of feel like Delver decks in Legacy. Because a lot of times Legacy players will play Pauper because it's an eternal format and they like playing with the old cards. But I just think it's more linked to what people like than what the numbers suggest is actually good.
I'm totally on Brian's side with that one. I don't know where I was going with that.
Like when I started,
I wouldn't pick up a Jeskai deck personally. Like, I haven't played against it yet. I played a lot of matchups against Boros previously, and even like the mirror decks. I know Black is basically unplayable right now, but to draw a parallel, if somebody showed up with Esper, you wouldn't think that they're playing it because Esper is the best deck right now. You would think that they're playing it because they like to cast black spells, right? So if we went to Jono and we were like, hey, you have to pick 2 other colors to play with Black, you'd probably pick blue and white just because he likes those colors. But that's because we're forcing him to play with more than just what he wants to be doing.
Like when I got into Pauper the first time, the first thing I was like, all right, I'm just building a Grixis deck, and every card in my deck is a 2-for-1, and this is what I like.
Yeah.
I just think people like that. It's like a lot of fun to beat people that way.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah, people do like it, and a lot of players on Jeskai are playing it because, they net decked a deck that plays a lot of cards they like. But at the same time, it's one of the decks in the format, Tron and Jeskai are the 2 best decks at playing a card that a lot of people are saying maybe is too powerful for Pauper in Ephemerate. It's one of the decks that's really leveraging that. And it's also the only non-monocolored deck that top-8'd the challenge this week. And
No, you're not wrong. I think it's the best 3-colored deck.
it has...
I think it's the best. If you're going to play 3 colors.
It's put up the results to back up, the amount of play it gets.
Absolutely. I didn't mean to interrupt, by the way.
No, you're
My
fine.
apologies. But I definitely think if you're going to play 3 colors and you want game against Tron and you want game against Stompy, and it is showing results, it's definitely the best 3-color deck to do that. But I do agree with Brian, whereas I don't think it's as good as everyone's making it out to be. Or it's kind of like the boogeyman of the format without having the bite that decks like Blue-Black Delver had in the past, where like you actually just couldn't do anything about them foiling your Quirion Ranger if you're playing Elves.
Yeah.
Like, they're not giving you a non-game on turn 1 at any point.
Okay.
So, like, sort of an interesting theory question. Would you guys play a deck that was every single matchup, it was 49% to win every single matchup? You just sit down, you're 49%.
Are you
But your
49%?
but your play skill versus your opponent's play skill factors. So if you're super good at Magic, then like you have a 49% matchup, but you're much better than your opponent is. Would you play this deck?
Yeah.
Maybe. I guess it depends on how I guess it depends on how much I like the deck, like how much I like playing the deck. If it's a deck I enjoy, then I probably would end up in there because
It's Jeskai. Because I think that's what Jeskai is. I think it's like 49% against everything. Or a lot of things. That's the way the matchup feels out. It's like one of those decks where, like, on the one hand, I think people overestimate their play skill versus a random opponent. And I would never play a deck that's 49% against the field, because I think when you take a deck like Stompy or Tron, you're like 60% against the field. Not against every single matchup, but like you're 60% to beat a random opponent. Because you just have these like wildly favorable matchups.
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of biased here because Tron's my deck, and I'm always going to be playing Tron if I have the opportunity to play Tron. So I might not, but it depends on the format. Like, in general, I might decide if it's not Pauper, if it's not Jeskai, if it's something else like a different format and something like that, I might. But it just.
So the way I'm hearing this is basically it comes down to if you feel like you want to be competitive, like if you're going to an event, if you're going to like you're playing the league this week, right? Right. So you're not taking Jeskai because you want to have the most competitive edge, and you don't think that 49% statistically against everything is statistically good enough to get you like. It's not like 4-0. If you're 49% against everything, that means you're losing 2.
Right.
But like we were saying earlier, people like to play this for fun, and I think there are metagames, obviously, because it was doing very well in the past, where it is well positioned, but like having fun and being competitive is kind of where the split becomes, right? When you're talking about a metagame like Jeskai. So Pauper was a casual format before, and people took it seriously, and they wanted to be more competitive about it, and it became what it is now.
Yeah.
So what you, I guess my follow-up question to that would be, is do you think that Pauper is headed in a more competitive direction, or do you think that, the fun decks that are easy to build online are going to saturate maybe that metagame?
One second. I want to come back to your question, but before we move on, I want to say that I heartily disagree with Brian's assessment that Jeskai is 48 or 49% against the field. You just wrote an article of the top 20 decks in Pauper, and I would argue that Jeskai is wildly favored against 15 to 17 of them.
I don't think it's.
And there's maybe
I don't think it's by a wide margin.
There's a few decks that Jeskai has, a 50-50 matchup against, namely, Stompy and Tron. We can argue the exact percentages in the matchups, but Jeskai against a lot of the field that you're talking about is going to be favored because it's doing some of the most powerful things in the format. I mean, it's going to beat, I'm trying to think, everything other than, like I said, Tron with a good draw and Stompy with a good draw.
Tron does not need a good draw. Tron needs an average draw to run over Jeskai.
Okay, so some of the top decks in the format are going to have a decent matchup against Jeskai, but most of the other decks are going to be wildly unfavored against the deck doing things like turn 4 Ephemerate Muldrifter.
Yeah, I guess that's the thing. It's 45% against some decks. It's like 60% against all the random crap.
I think it's good matchups are against the random crap, though. Like, the format is moving in this, like, people are playing a lot of Tron. They're playing a lot of, like, Jeskai, like you said. And then they're playing these, like, monocolored decks. And, like, I feel like it pushes out the, like, sort of in-the-middle decks that Jeskai is actually good at beating.
And I would go so far as to say that if we lived in a Pauper metagame where Urza's Tower was not a card, Jeskai would be far and away the best deck because they wouldn't have to hedge against Tron.
I agree.
You would see them loading up against aggro, and these monocolored decks wouldn't even have a place in the format.
I can totally get on board with that.
So the fact that Jeskai is able to kind of ride the fence between being a control deck and being an aggro deck makes it playable, and it's showing results. So, I mean, if you ask me, do you take Jeskai to a big event? Yeah, absolutely.
So it's not like I'm saying the deck is bad. I'm just saying, like, I think it's like more of an in the middle deck. I don't think it's one of like the decks that give you like the highest EV to win every round. I think it's like not in that elite tier. It's like the next tier down.
Okay, and I guess that's just a difference of opinion because I do put it in that elite tier that
fair enough.
I mean, the past challenge winners have been either low to the ground aggro or Jeskai. I mean, it's putting up results, so I don't think you can just ignore a deck that is winning challenges.
Yeah,
and say that it's in a tier below anything else.
It's won more challenges than Tron has.
So
It
you
gets
look
played
at
a lot more than Tron does, though.
Yeah.
It has more people buying Jeskai lottery tickets than Tron tickets.
Yeah.
Especially online too, with all the clicks.
Yeah, Tron is a very hard deck to play online. I'm a Tron player, and I don't play Tron online.
That's the only reason I don't play Tortured Existence online, because I don't want to spend 5 minutes getting back one Spore Frog.
So, that's Jeskai, and we're going to spend some more time, in future episodes, really diving into the matchups that Jeskai has. I mean, we threw out a lot of random, percentages, and, you can take those with a grain of salt. But we're going to spend some time in later episodes really digging into how these matchups play out and, what deck.
I mean, I'm not going to argue with hard math. That'd be sweet.
Yeah, and that's something we're going to get into. One other thing I wanted to talk about, we're kind of running up against the clock, but there's a banned and restricted announcement coming up here pretty soon. We don't know for sure that anything's going to change in Pauper, but I kind of wanted to pick your guys' brain and see, do you think any changes need to be made? Are you happy with the state of the meta? What makes a good meta? And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I am very happy with the metagame. I think there's enough balance. I think there's enough decks that win. I don't even think the best deck is that much better than the second best deck. Even though my bias might show that I disagree with that, but I don't. I think the metagame's in a very good spot.
I wouldn't ban anything right now either, but I would be open to bannings in the future if things like continue to consolidate a little bit. But it does seem like there's like decks that beat everything. There's no deck that's like running away with the show, but I do worry that Tron could be the kind of deck that if it gets more players playing it, like more people are just like, you know what, the heck with it, I'm going to figure out how to play this on Moto. Like that it could be the kind of, because like we talk about it, it's like what's Tron's bad matchup and nobody knows.
Yeah.
Like it might not have one.
Yeah, and I was talking to Ricardo Matana, I mentioned it on our last episode, and he said basically that when he's going to brew a deck, or when, some of the other Brazilian players that he brews with go to brew a deck, their first question they ask is, can this play against Tron? And if the answer is not a resounding yes, then it's back to the drawing board. They don't even bother looking at it.
Yeah, I believe Tron is the best deck, and I refuse to play decks that are bad against Tron.
Yeah.
Except for Stompy.
Except for
Which is like actually I think like a close matchup. Because you're fast enough and they do have a tendency to stumble a little bit that like you can kill them.
Yeah, and we're seeing, the reason I brought this topic up to begin with is, if you look at any Pauper content out there, you're going to see people calling for bans on card X or card Y. Arkham's Astrolabe gets thrown out there. Urza's Tower gets thrown out there. Ephemerate. And I think it's just because everybody kind of has a different opinion on what the format ought to be. Taking Arkham's Astrolabe, for example, some people call for bans on Astrolabe because they see, those mana restrictions in Pauper as kind of intrinsic to what makes the format. They see that as an inherent part of what makes Pauper. Whereas other people, they think perfect fixing is great. They say bring in fetch lands. So there's this wide, span of opinions on what the format should be. And I think it seems like we're kind of all in agreement that Pauper's in a pretty good place right now and maybe is approaching what we think it should be, I guess.
Like even with a best deck that's like kind of obnoxious, it's still one of the best formats I've played in the past 5 years. So why would I want to ban something from like one of the best formats I've played in 5 years? It's fine.
Super open.
Even this top 8 has.
Well, it has 7 monocolored beatdown decks.
4, 5, 7 monocolored beatdown decks, but there's 7.
Who doesn't want to play that format though? Come on.
I think that as long as we don't have like a Hogak or like a blue-black Delver like we had in Pauper a while back, or like a Peregrine Drake, I butchered that name. I'm gonna keep going though. I think that's when the format starts to look unhealthy. That's when there needs to be some kind of banning. And then outside of that, I complain about cards sometimes, and I call for bannings, but I don't think that every time that I personally call for a ban, that it should be banned, because I know that'd be terrible looking back on it. Like in hindsight, I would look back and go, this is terrible now. Like, it opened its up to other decks that are just as bad.
The DCI has a lot more information about this than we do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It just
It's
gets
all-
boring after a while, too, right?
It's also worth noting here that while it's 7 monocolored beatdown decks, 4 of the colors are represented in these monocolored. There's a
Absolutely.
mono white deck, a mono red deck, mono green deck, and mono blue deck.
Poor Mono Black.
So I think, just kind of
Don't
as
even
we
get me started, guys.
as we come up on the end of our time today, a more constructive conversation maybe that people out there can be having rather than should we ban this or should we ban that, which really just it just fans the flames and makes people mad at each other, is what do you want this format to look like? What kinds of things do you want to be a part of Pauper? And I think that's going to lead to a lot healthier discussions, and it's something that I want to get into a little bit, maybe in a future episode when we have a little bit more time to dig into it. Something that we mentioned in a past episode was there's kind of a dearth of combo decks in Pauper right now. That's something that I'd like to see come back, and maybe that's not a problem that a ban solves. Maybe that's something that, Wizards can look at in a future set that say, hey, this card might help combo decks become a part of Pauper again. And I don't know, what are you guys' thoughts on that?
I think it's really hard to balance cards that are good for combo, and a lot of the times Wizards is probably gonna err on the side of caution and not print those cards.
Right, and I'm not saying they need to print it in the next set or I'm quitting Pauper, but I think those are the types of discussions moving forward, as a Pauper community that we need to be having rather than just saying, oh, they printed a card that's good mana fixing, we need to ban that to make Pauper great again or
I
something
agree.
like that.
I kind of like that the pace setters for the format are the aggro decks rather than the combo decks. Like, I think it would create a lot of problems if the combo decks were faster than the aggro decks, because then it forces you to play counter spells. In this format, you don't actually have to play counter spells, but there's a lot of upside to playing them. They're very good, but you don't have to. But like, if there was a deck that just like comboed off on 3 consistently, like Tribe, it really like forces you to play things to interact with combo decks. So I kind of like just this aggro versus, it's a lot of aggro mid-range control dynamic more so than like combo aggro control.
Okay. Awesome. Well, we are at our time today, so I guess we're going to end the discussion there. Want to, again, thank RIW Hobbies. They are our lone sponsor, our lone host. Again, thank Magic Mike, our producer, and hope you guys tune in next week.
Pauper like hot. Pauper like hot. Pauper like hot. Pauper like hot. Pauper like